Lately, the Chris Tomlin song, "Is He Worthy?" has been playing in the back of my mind. Many of you who are here now participated in recording that song for our Easter service this spring. Perhaps you recall the words, "Do you feel the world is broken?" We do. "Do you feel the shadows deepen?" We do. But do you know that all the dark can't stop the light from getting through? We do. Do you wish that you could see it all made new? We do. As that litany of questions and responses has resonated deeply in my heart lately, and I expect the hearts of many of us in this season with so many layers of brokenness so evident in our world, I find myself hearing our Old Testament passage from Exodus 17 from what I hope is a more compassionate, more human and humane perspective than I used to. Honestly, I used to hear the Israelites' question in this story, "Is the Lord among us or not?" as a rather ungrateful one, showing a decided lack of faith. I mean, after all, Yahweh has just dramatically delivered the Israelites from Egypt, besting their Egyptian oppressors and their gods with plagues, and drowning Pharaoh's pursuing army in the Red Sea. Then, in a redemptive reversal, instead of using the forces of nature for the destruction of oppression and evil as he had in Egypt, God uses elements of nature such as air, fire, vegetation, and water to reveal himself to the Israelites in healing ways. They're guided by a pillar of cloud by day and warmed and protected by a pillar of fire at night. God turns undrinkable water sweet with a tree branch, drops a huge flock of quail at their feet with a wind, and saturates the morning dew each day with manna, as we read together last week. How can the Israelites possibly ask whether or not God is among them? But in today's story, the people aren't merely whining. This is a people in crisis. Men and women, old and young, babies, and even livestock. All that they have known of earthly provision for the past 400 years is irretrievably behind them. And now, in an unknown wilderness, far from that previous home, the most basic of life's needs is absent. There is no water in sight. Their lives are at risk. The question that they ask, "Is the Lord among us or not?" is an honest, radical, primordial question that virtually every one of us asks during our lifetimes, often more than once. In circumstances of desperation and survival, this is not a question that requires a merely doctrinal, cognitive response. In today's reading, Moses himself as a leader was incredibly frustrated with and honestly fearful of the people of Israel. Moses names the place Massa for quarreling, in the tone of actually bringing a lawsuit against someone, and Meribah for testing, because he said people are testing the Lord. But notice that God himself did not express anger, frustration, or irritation with the Israelites for asking the question. What God does do in a story, in response to frightened people who are desperate to save their own lives and the lives of their children and families and friends and livestock, is to provide for them what they need: abundant, fresh water. Because we're so distant in time, geography, and culture from the Israelites in the desert, and because we know from other parts of the story that the people do at times kind of whine and complain unreasonably, we can easily miss listening to the legitimacy of their need in this story. But God never loses perspective. God no doubt remembers that they are but dust, that they have spent the last 4 centuries living in dependency on their Egyptian oppressors, that they need to learn firsthand his covenantal, committed care for each and every one of them. God already has plans for that, as we'll see in the coming weeks as we read of when the Israelites reach Mount Sinai. But for now, at this juncture in the Israelites' journey, they ask the question, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And God responds not with rebuke for the question, but by beginning with tangible provision to assure them that he is among them and that he cares for them. They still have a long journey ahead to learn the truth of that ever more deeply. For the question of God's presence with and for us is a question whose answer we are meant to know in the depth of every cell in our bodies. For that, provision is not enough. Words are not enough. Wishful thinking is not enough. We need to know. We were created to know in all our ways of knowing, including the kind of knowing that literally flows through our blood and enters every cell of our bodies. The response to this question that the scriptures and the incarnation of God and Jesus affirm with a solid yes, the Lord is indeed among us. Wonder of wonders. But how can we really, truly know this in a way that our faith grows deeper than the pains we suffer? I suggest to you that we witness one way that we humans learn more deeply the truth of God being among us in the way that God interacts with Moses in this story, a way that's deeply personal, tailor-made to help his own faith grow even deeper into the marrow of his bones as he experiences that God truly sees him and knows him. Recall that Moses is feeling quite threatened by the people in this episode. Wisely, Moses shares his fear and frustration with God. We read, "So Moses cried out to the Lord, 'What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me.'" We know from neuroscience of human emotions that because Moses is fearful for his survival, what neuroscientists call being activated and what psychologists call being triggered, his cognitive reasoning abilities are compromised, and his bodily systems of fight, flight, or freeze are fully activated. This is an example of why God's redemption, including our reception of his gift of faith to us, is not meant to be only gray matter deep. That is, it cannot be only cognitive, only rational, not only an assent to stated doctrine. When our brains and bodies are activated by intense fear or sadness, we quite literally cannot take in much through our rational faculties. And for life's brokenness and tragedies and traumas, we need our trust in God, our faith, to permeate deep into our physical, spiritual, and emotional faculties through the gates that are open to them, if we are to remain open to the fullness of the redemption that God desires for us and for all the world. So in Moses' activated state, God gives him clear, tangible, step-by-step instructions that he knows Moses will be able to follow. First of all, go ahead of the people. Secondly, take some of the elders of Israel with you. Thirdly, take the staff with which you struck the Nile. Fourthly, go. I will be standing there in front of the rock at Horeb, right in front of you. Fifth, strike the rock and water will come out of it so that the people may drink. Now God knows that as Moses follows these instructions, the gates to his embodied understanding and faith will resonate with or echo previous experiences that Moses has had with God just a few months before, through the gates of his implicit memories, those memories that accompany his rational ways of knowing, but actually transcend them, and which are literally processed in different ways in our brains. So when Moses first found himself encountered by God at the burning bush, called to return to Egypt and lead the people out of bondage to the promised land, it was at Mount Horeb, the very same place to which God is sending Moses now. There at the burning bush, Moses encountered God alone. But this time, he's to take some of the elders of Israel with him to witness in technicolor God's calling upon Moses to lead the Israelites. Moses is to take the staff in his hand to strike the rock. This is the same staff that he had with him at the burning bush. It's the same staff that he was commanded to use to strike the Nile River to turn it to blood. That time in the sight of Pharaoh and his advisors. This time, Moses is commanded to strike the rock at Horeb in the sight of the elders of Israel, and bring forth not blood, but the water the people need for life. And finally, crucially important, God assures Moses that he himself will be standing in front of him at the rock. Moses can look towards Horeb and see God standing there waiting for him. God will be seen by Moses, and importantly, Moses will be seen by God. Moses will find himself the recipient of the blessing of God's face turned toward him, his countenance lifted upon him, his face shining on him, and in so doing, him granting Moses peace in the midst of this intense situation by giving Moses this experience of being seen and being known, the experience of being loved. Throughout this entire experience, orchestrated so precisely by God, implicit sensory memories of Moses' previous encounters with God will be open. His kinesthetic memory through walking the familiar path to Horeb. His sensory memory as he feels the weight of the staff in his hand as he walks, and as he feels it vibrate as it strikes the rock, and as he hears that crack of the staff against the rock. Through the familiar smells, the familiar wilderness air in the shadow of the mountain, the familiar angles of light as he approaches the place of meeting. The entire gestalt of this significant place in Moses' life will pour into him in ways that will enable him to feel himself again, felt, seen, and known by God as he was that day at the burning bush, on an ordinary day of shepherding. Today, he will be awakened to those memories in the midst of a life crisis. Psychiatrist and neurotheologian Kurt Thompson, who specializes in describing ways in which our Christian lives are transformed and how that affects our bodies, writes this: the process of being known is the vessel in which our lives are kneaded and molded, lanced and sutured, confronted and comforted, bringing God's new creation closer to its fullness in preparation for the return of the King. To be known is to be pursued, examined, and shaken. To be known is to be loved and to have hopes and even demands placed upon you. It is to risk not only the furniture in your home being rearranged, but your floor plans being rewritten, your walls being demolished and reconstructed. To be known means that you allow your shame and guilt to be exposed in order for them to be healed. Being known in this way is incredibly vulnerable and takes courage, especially in our culture where success is venerated. It's not something we come to naturally as adults who've experienced the betrayals and disappointments and the shocks of the broken world in which we live. And we will shy away from such knowing most often until we are deeply shaken, until we feel the world is broken and we feel the shadows deepen, as Chris Tomlin's song puts it. At such times, and many of us are living in such times now, we may very well discover ourselves asking the question, is the Lord among us or not? Not as a doctrinal, rational question, but as a deeply experienced, visceral wondering. And when we find ourselves asking that question, it doesn't mean that we've lost our faith. In fact, it's very likely that we're finding ourselves invited to have our faith deepened in ways that go beyond what we can put into words. And this invitation is from the God who created us both to ask the question and to know in the deepest recesses of our beings the truth of the fact that we are made for being the dwelling place of God, as evidenced from our creation in Eden to the consummation of the age, as we read in the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. So asking the question, is God among us or not, is never meant to be the end of the story. In fact, asking the question can be the beginning of a transformed life, but only if we allow ourselves to feel the pain of having our walls being demolished and our floor plans reconstructed in the company of God and others. As an aside, just a quick aside, in today's gospel reading, the priest being very defensive about Jesus' authority, questioning implicitly, is God among us in this man, followed the day after Jesus had ridden into Jerusalem on the donkey and literally rearranged the furniture of the temple, upending the tables of the money changers and the chairs of the dove sellers. We're not meant to plumb the depths of that question alone. Though our experience of knowing God deeply will always be tremendously personal, it is one that ultimately takes place in community. So Moses met God alone at the burning bush at Horeb, But he was led back to the rock of Horeb in the company of the elders and in the company of the entire community of Israel as a means of deepening not only the elders' faith in Moses as a leader, but of deepening Moses' faith, his knowing God and himself to be known by God in ways that would eventually, literally, transform his very self, his being, so that light could shine forth from his face, reflecting the light of God's countenance shining upon him. In these uncertain, chaotic, wearying, deeply painful times in which we live, and there's so many layers of that for us, we can try to dodge the question, is the Lord among us or not? But we can only dodge the question for so long. We were created to know and to deeply know the true response. We ask the question most deeply, most fully, when we allow ourselves to feel our pain, our fear, our anger, and the pain and the fear and anger of others authentically. But those feelings are not the end of the story. If we will not ignore and not numb, but allow the stirrings of our depths and share those stirrings with God and with trustworthy companions, they are paths not only to the radical question, but more importantly, to God's radical response, his, I will never leave you orphaned. I will come to you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. So, beloved friends, may we be graced to let ourselves ask the question and perceive and receive God's response to us. The Lord truly dwells among us. May we learn deep in the marrow of our bones that God's countenance is lifted toward us, that God is so very gracious to us in the midst of our tender needs. There's a grace ready to meet not only our needs, but the needs of the very broken world, which God so loves. Amen.